Let's turn together in our Bibles to Acts chapter 27. For those of you that have been tracking with us, I know what you're thinking right now. Wait a minute, we just skipped like 5 chapters ahead. And so just hold on. Over the next few weeks as we close out this sermon series through the book of Acts, we're going to bounce around a little bit because this last section is really just one narrative. As the Apostle Paul goes from one trial to the next trial to the next trial, as he goes from one situation to the next, it really is one narrative. And so I want to, over the next few weeks, kind of weave in and out of these last chapters of the book of Acts. And today we are in Acts chapter 27. And just to set the scene for us a little bit here, is the Apostle Paul was arrested in Acts chapter 22. And that's where we really left off last week when we talked about the power of testimony. And we talked about the importance of our posture when we are interacting and engaging with people that don't like us, and how we have to have respect and gentleness. And so the Apostle Paul gets arrested and he's shipped around to different places. He gets to talk in front of kings and generals, sharing the gospel. But ultimately, we find here Jesus telling Paul that he is going to go to Rome. So in chapter 23, verse 11, the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." And so the Apostle Paul has this calling, this confidence that comes from his calling, that he is eventually going to end up in Rome. Regardless of his circumstance, the Lord has revealed to him that his final destination is Rome. And so Paul has this supernatural confidence that that is where he's going to end up, because that's where Jesus said he was sending him. And then we find in Acts chapter 27, Paul sails for Rome. Paul sails for Rome, and we're going to pick up the story in verse 13. And the heading over this passage in my Bible is simply the storm. And today I want to talk about God showing up in the midst of the storms of life. That we can encounter the power and the presence of God in the valleys of life more so than the mountaintops. That the valleys hold superior potential to experience the power and the presence of God than the mountaintops. We all want the mountaintops and we pray for the mountaintops. But the truth is that fruit doesn't grow on the mountaintops. Fruit only grows in the valleys. The mountaintops have breathtaking views, but the valleys are where our faith is forged. And so today I want to talk about God showing up in the midst of the catastrophic storms that sweep across our life and leave devastation in their wake. Let's begin in verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the nor'easter swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.' On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down in the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved.' So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away." That's not all of the story, but that's enough for us today. That's a pretty big bite of the Bible that we just took. And it's interesting to me that this is the longest narrative in the book of Acts. I found it interesting as I studied this past week that there are 50-something verses. I think it might be 55 verses in this narrative that God is using Luke to write the book of Acts. And as Luke is inspired by God, he is inspired to describe this journey to Rome and this shipwreck in particular in detail. If you look back and you want to do some contrast, right, in Acts chapter 2, this is one of the most important events in the entire Bible. And in Acts chapter 2, we have the falling of the Spirit in verses 1 to 13. This is the day of Pentecost. So we have 13 verses, and then if you include Peter's sermon after, all of chapter 2 is 47 verses. Right? And there's other monumental moments in the book of Acts in the history of Christianity. For instance, the conversion of Saul of Tarsus in Acts chapter 9. And in Acts chapter 9, there are 18 verses devoted to the conversion of Saul on the Damascus Road. Another monumental moment in the book of Acts is Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council, when they're trying to decide what to do with the Gentiles, and they make this decision that shifts the trajectory of the church, that radically shifts the trajectory of the future of the church. And in Acts chapter 15, we see this monumental event described in 41 verses. Actually, no, it's back up here. 35 verses, sorry. In 35 verses. And so, I don't want to make too much of this, but the fact that there are 50-something verses describing this particular event in the book of Acts, that's a pretty big chunk of religious real estate, of biblical real estate there, to say, why is God inspiring Luke to go into such great detail about this particular story? There are lots of things that happen that aren't even recorded for us in Scripture. By the providence of God, we have what we have because that's what He wanted us to have. And this story that begins in chapter 27 and runs through the end of the book where Paul reaches Rome. So Paul sails for Rome in the beginning of chapter 27, and then he arrives in Rome in halfway through chapter 28. So there's 50-something verses is what I'm saying, and that's why I find it significant. There's something going on here, right? Okay, there's something happening in this story that we really need to pause. We need to park over this passage and ask the Lord to reveal to us what He wants us to learn. Because again, this is the longest narrative in the book of Acts, and we find it at the end. And what we find here is incredibly relevant because we find one of God's best servants in the midst of catastrophe. As the ship is breaking apart, literally breaking apart around him. And I want us to see this. I want us to go back and unpack this passage and what's happening around Paul and what is potentially happening within Paul. Because we all face times in life when we aren't sure we're going to come out the other side of the situation. We all face those times in life when we feel like it's over for us. Those times when we're drowning in the deep end and our strength is waning. Those times when we think we're not going to survive the situation. Those times when our back is against the wall and there's no way out. Those times in life when all hope seems lost. Notice that here, that we read this in chapter 27, verse 20. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. That's an incredibly relevant passage because there are those times in life when the storm rages on and the ship is slowly coming apart and we don't see the sun. We're lost in the hurricane and we don't see a way out. Those times when all hope seems lost. It's not a question of if the storms hit, it's a question of when they hit. And for us as kingdom people to have the right perspective, a biblical worldview as we perceive and interpret our circumstances through the lens of our faith. It's not if tragedy visits our life, but when. What happens when catastrophe strikes? What happens when tragedy hits close to home? What happens when disaster destroys our dreams? There are times in all of our lives when we are rocked by catastrophic storms. These are the kind of storms that change the landscape of our lives, the kind of storms that change us forever. If we survive it, we will never be the same. My wife is from Louisiana and she grew up with hurricanes. And a hurricane is mentioned in our passage in verse 14. A wind of hurricane force called a northeaster. Now there are different categories of hurricane. And they categorize these storms based upon their strength, based upon their potential for destruction. A Category 1 storm has winds up to 95 miles per hour. A Category 2 has winds up to 110 miles per hour. A Category 3 up to 129. A Category 4 hurricane has winds up to 156 miles per hour. And then a Category 5, which is the highest level of storm, has winds in excess of 156 miles per hour. This is a catastrophic storm. And not only that, but hurricanes, as they hammer a part of the coast, they create their own weather system. These hurricanes are hundreds of miles wide, 400 miles wide. And so they create their own weather systems, and hurricanes typically spawn tornadoes. So it's not enough that you're getting hammered by a catastrophic storm, but this storm spawns other storms. And so that is what happens in a lot of our lives when we are rocked by these storms, is that there's other things happening around us. As we are trying to survive the hurricane itself spawns tornadoes, and so we are sometimes getting hammered on all sides. Paul is in the midst of a hurricane, and the ship he is on is being torn apart by this storm. And we find out later in the passage that there are 276 souls aboard this ship. It's a fairly large ship. We don't know how many are prisoners and how many are soldiers and how many are sailors, but we do know that the soldiers have likely been extremely well trained by the one world superpower, Rome. These men have likely seen battle. Many of them are probably career soldiers, and they have the scars to prove that they have been on battlefields. The sailors that are on this ship, many of whom have made a career out of being on the water and have likely survived multiple storms. And there's also a group of hardened criminals that have been convicted for their crimes and are going to Rome to fight as gladiators in the arena or to be fed to wild beasts. So, in summary, this ship is full of hard men and tough guys. These are the kind of guys you don't want to mess with. But this particular storm rattles all of them. Their courage erodes as the storm rages on for days and days. And they eventually end up in full-on panic mode. I say this to emphasize the fierceness of this particular storm. This is a Category 5 hurricane, what some people call the finger of God. And yet there's Paul the tent maker, Paul the academic, Paul the church planter, Paul the pastor, Paul the theologian. There's Paul in the midst of these soldiers and sailors and prisoners and convicts, and he is the only one not freaking out. As far as we know, Paul was not a physically impressive man. The sight of Paul did not inspire people. We don't really know a lot about his physical appearance, but there's one description that we have, an extra biblical description of the Apostle Paul. And let's just say this, he probably didn't fit in this crowd of soldiers and sailors and prisoners. Yet there's Paul standing in the midst of these hardened men, these tough guys, and he's the only one keeping his composure, and his confidence becomes contagious. Now, here's something else that we need to realize, that at any moment, God could have stopped this storm. One snap of Jesus' fingers and bam, it would have been blue skies and clear sailing. God could have stopped the storm, but he didn't. There's a story in the Gospels of Jesus being in a boat with his disciples in the midst of a severe storm, and they woke Jesus up and one word from Jesus and the storm went away. He didn't even have to speak it, but he spoke it for the benefit of his disciples. He just had to think it. That's the power that he has over the elements. That's the power that he has over the storm. He's the master of the wind and the waves. But he does not stop the storm here because there is something else going on. There is a providential purpose. Now, Paul is headed to Rome, and they eventually land on this tiny island of Malta. And here's what I want us to realize is that Malta is not on their itinerary. No one ever imagined that this is where they would end up. No one in 100 years would have ever put Malta on their itinerary. Malta is a rocky island located 62 miles south of Sicily in the Mediterranean Sea. This island is 17 miles long and 9 miles wide. It's an insignificant place. There are no VIPs on Malta. But God, in his providence, wants these anonymous islanders to hear the gospel, and so he sends the storm to redirect his servant. He sends them to Malta. Paul thinks he's going to Rome, and he eventually will end up there. But there are some stops along the way, some unanticipated stops along the way. And I want us to think for a moment. We've talked about the storm raging around the Apostle Paul. We've talked about the panic happening on the ship. But what is potentially happening within the Apostle Paul? I want us to remember the series of events that is unfolding towards the end of Acts. Paul is ambushed at the temple in chapter 21, and hundreds of people are attempting to literally beat him to death. He is being pummeled, and he is the target of their rage. He's punched in the face by religious leaders in chapter 23, and a group of assassins commit to kill him. Chapter 24 is relatively short, but it contains 2 years of Paul's life as he waits in prison. 2 years. There's another plot to kill him in chapter 25. There's this crazy shipwreck in chapter 27. And just when you think you've come to the other side, he's bit by a viper in chapter 28. Now, it would have been easy for the Apostle Paul to simply have given up. Remember now, this is after 20 years of faithful sacrificial service. This is the Apostle Paul that has left everything for the sake of the gospel. This is the Apostle Paul that has endured multiple beatings and slander and injustice for the sake of the gospel. The Apostle Paul that's constantly on the run. He's in danger in the cities. He's in danger in the country. He's being betrayed by friends. And it would have been easy for the Apostle Paul just to say in the midst of the storm, just kill me now and get it over with. But Paul does not lose heart. Paul refuses to panic. And here's the thing, Paul doesn't throw a pity party. No. He has this supernaturally positive perspective, even in the midst of tragic circumstances. Paul sees the hand of God in the midst of the injustice. Paul sees a higher purpose to his pain. And all of us can have this supernatural vision when we begin to perceive and interpret our circumstances through the lens of our faith. God can redeem every tragedy. God can give purpose to our pain and significance to our suffering and meaning to our misery. Let me say that again, because this is incredibly relevant. As we journey through this life, we are sinful human beings that live in a broken world. So it's not if we encounter suffering, it's when. God can give purpose to our pain and significance to our suffering and meaning to our misery. Paul, the same Paul that is in the midst of the storm in Acts 27 writes in Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. One paraphrase puts that verse this way: we are confident that God is able to orchestrate everything to work towards something good and meaningful when we love him and accept his invitation to live according to his plans. I really want you to lean in here for a moment. I want you to really receive this next statement. Christians are never the victim of circumstance. I'm going to let that sit on your plate for a moment as you think about taking it in, as you push it around on your plate. Christians are never the victims of circumstance. Too many Christians have a victim mentality. We feel like we're at the mercy of the people with the most power. We feel like we're at the mercy of the storm. The reality is that we are only ever at the mercy of God. This is the doctrine of divine providence, and this doctrine of providence teaches that God holds every event occurs according to God's sovereign will. The Heidelberg Catechism declares all things come not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. In Isaiah chapter 45, verses 5-7, says, I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me, so that from the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, people may know there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. Listen to this. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things. At the beginning of the book of Job, Job is speaking to his wife in chapter 2, verse 10. He says to her, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. We are sinful human beings that live in a broken world, and it's not if we experience tragedy, it's when. And the doctrine of providence can preempt disillusionment. God can redeem the tragedy. God can give purpose to our pain and significance to our sorrow and meaning to our misery. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9. What no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him. I want to take a part of Romans 8:28 and a part of 1 Corinthians 2:9, whom the same Spirit inspired the same person, the Apostle Paul, to write both of these passages. Back in Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And in 1 Corinthians 2:9, the things God has prepared for those who love him. You see, in order to love God, we have to see who God truly is. The Bible says that it's not that we first loved God, but that God loved us and sent his son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. And so our love is a response to his love, and his love is ultimately manifested through the crucifixion of his son, Jesus Christ. And so at some point we have to stand at the foot of the cross, and we have to look up, and we have to see what God did to demonstrate his love for us. What God did to prove that we matter to him, to prove that he loves us. God demonstrates his love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And so once we come to this place of seeing the love of God displayed through the sacrifice of his son, and then our love is a response to that divine manifestation, that ultimate demonstration of love, then now we have this love in our heart that is based upon the gospel. It's based upon what God has already done. And if that's all God ever did for us, if God never did another thing for us as long as we live, then we know that he's already done enough through Jesus Christ. And we experience every tragedy in the shadow of the cross. The ultimate tragedy in the history of humanity is the torture and the murder of the Messiah. And so his pain absorbs ours. His sorrow, his betrayal, that we find ultimate comfort not in God answering our questions, but in God sharing our sorrow and sharing our suffering. For those who love him. This is the key, because when we love him, we trust him. When we love him, we don't have to understand everything that's happening. We don't have to have all of our questions answered. And this is the first step. This is the first step to surviving catastrophic storms, is knowing God as the anchor, the ultimate anchor. Isaiah 43:19 says, I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the desert. When all hope seems lost, when we've received that devastating diagnosis, when we have these catastrophic relational problems, when there's storms hitting us on all sides, don't lose hope. Don't give up. God can show up in special ways in the midst of the catastrophe. God can send an angel down into the shipwreck. The last thing I want us to say before we go to the Lord's table, the last thing I want to say is found in chapter 27, verse 32. And it's interesting here. I'll start in verse 31. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. Verse 32. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. So the challenge for us today is to cut the ropes and to put our full faith in God, so that if God doesn't show up, we are in serious trouble. You see, we all spend so much time and energy constructing lifeboats as contingency plans just in case God decides not to show up. And what they did here is they did something that doesn't make sense. But they cut the lifeboats and watched as they drifted into the fog, into the storm. So some of us today need to stop clinging to the lifeboats of our own creation. And whatever it is you're holding on to in your hands, right? As the ship is being rocked by the storm, as people around you are rattled and they're losing hope and they're panicking, right? If you're clinging to a life preserver, if you're clinging to a lifeboat, right? And we strap all of these contingency plans to the ship of our lives, right? Just in case. We have contingency plan. We have safety nets. And today I'm asking us to drop all of our safety nets, whatever it is you're holding in your hand, and simply reach towards God. Say, God, I put my full faith in you. I put my full trust in you. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know how this is going to play out. I don't see a way out. My back is against the wall. When all hope seems lost, we just lift our hands towards heaven and say, God, I believe in you. God, I have faith in you. God, I trust you. I don't understand my circumstances. I'm confused by my circumstances, but I love you. I trust you. And so today, I'm asking that God would manifest himself to you in the midst of this Category 5 storm. And that Christians in our families, in our communities, should be the ones, as the ship is sinking, as our culture is circling the drain, Christians should be the ones keeping their composure in the midst of the chaos. Christians should be the one not losing their minds, so easily triggered, because our hope is not connected to our circumstance. Our hope is connected to something transcendent, something that never changes. Our hope is connected to God.